House number 17 did not simply sit at the end of the road, it loomed there, a jagged silhouette against the bruised purple of the evening sky. It was a structural anomaly, a relic of an era that the rest of the neighborhood had long since tried to forget. While the other houses on the street boasted freshly painted fences and the warm, golden glow of family dinners through their windows, number 17 remained a void. It was a place where the sunlight seemed to lose its strength, filtered through the thick, unmoving canopy of gnarled oaks that guarded the property like skeletal sentinels. I remember the day I moved in. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and wet earth. The rain wasn't heavy, but it was persistent, a cold, needle-like drizzle that soaked into my skin. I stood on the porch, watching the landlord fumble with a heavy ring of iron keys. He was a man who looked as though he were made of gray ash, his skin translucent, and his eyes darting toward the tree line as if expecting something to emerge. He didn't offer a tour. He didn't explain how the boiler worked or where the fuse box was hidden. He simply pressed the cold metal of the key into my palm and whispered, his breath smelling of stale tobacco. "The walls here, they have a memory. If you hear something at night, a settling of the wood, a rattle in the pipes, ignore it. Do not go looking for the source. Some things are better left in the dark." I watched him scurry to his car, his tires splashing through the mud as he fled. I laughed. At 28, I was cynical, fueled by caffeine and a belief that the world was entirely explainable through physics. I thought the rent, barely a quarter of the market rate, was a reward for my lack of superstition. I walked inside, the floorboards groaning under my boots, and felt the first shiver of the house's cold embrace. It wasn't a draft, it was a stillness so profound it felt heavy. The first few nights were eventful, but not peaceful. The house was a symphony of minor irritations. The windows rattled in their frames despite the lack of wind. The wallpaper, a sickly floral pattern from the 1970s, seemed to peel a fraction of an inch further every time I turned my back. I spent my hours unpacking boxes, the sound of my own footsteps echoing too loudly in the hollow hallways. Then came the midnight of the fourth day. I was jolted from a dreamless sleep. There was no transition from unconsciousness to alertness. I was simply awake, every nerve ending on fire. The room was pitch black, save for the digital clock on the bedside table. The numbers were a violent, bleeding crimson. 2:17 a.m. Then the sound arrived. Knock, knock, knock. It was rhythmic, calculated. 3 distinct raps against the drywall directly behind my pillow. It wasn't the erratic scratching of a rodent or the metallic thumb of a water hammer. It was the sound of a knuckle, solid, bone-deep, striking wood. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, turning into a silent wheeze. I waited for a fourth knock. It never came. I waited for the sound of footsteps on the other side of the wall. Silence. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the wallpaper. It was ice cold, vibrating slightly as if the wall itself were humming. The next day, I tried to be rational. I tore a small hole in the wallpaper to inspect the structure. Behind the paper was nothing but solid lath and plaster. No crawl space, no hidden pipes, just dead, hollow space. Yet the feeling of being watched persisted. Everywhere I went, the kitchen, the narrow bathroom, the steep stairs, I felt a gaze boring in the back of my neck. By the second week, Sleep was a luxury I could no longer afford. I was a ghost in my own home, my eyes rimmed with dark circles, my hands shaking as I poured coffee. Every night at 2:17 a.m., the knocks returned. Cock, cock, cock. 3 times, always 3. I began to see things in the periphery of my vision, a shadow moving across the floor when the curtains were closed, the smell of old, unwashed wool drifting through the hallway. One afternoon, driven by a desperate need for human contact, I walked across the street to the only other occupied house. Mrs. Gable was an ancient woman, her skin a map of 1,000 sorrows. She didn't let me past the threshold. She stood in the sliver of her doorway, her eyes fixed on house number 17 behind me. "You're the new one," she said, her voice a dry rasp. I saw the lights. I told myself I wouldn't care, but I see you're already fading. I just want to know about the history, the knocking. What is it? She looked at me then, really looked at me, and a flicker of pity crossed her face. "Before you, there was a man named Elias. He lasted 3 months. Before him, a couple. They left in the middle of the night, leaving all their furniture behind. But the first ones, they were the ones who left the mark. A father who couldn't handle a child who wouldn't speak. A boy who was broken in his eyes. They say the father built a room within a room, a space where the world couldn't hear the boy's silence. My blood turned to lead. What happened to the boy? The father said he ran away, but sometimes, on quiet nights, the neighborhood used to hear a sound, a rhythmic tapping coming from the foundations. The police found nothing. The walls were too thick. The secrets were too deep. I returned to the house, my mind a storm of static. I went straight to the ground floor, tearing away the heavy velvet curtains in the hallway. There, hidden behind a tall mahogany wardrobe I hadn't moved since arrival, was a door. It was small, barely 5 feet tall, constructed of heavy oak and reinforced with iron bands. There was no handle, only a massive rusted padlock that looked like it belonged to a dungeon cell. I grabbed a crowbar from my toolbox, fueled by a manic energy. I didn't care about the landlord's warning. I didn't care about the lease. I needed to see the mistake.
It took an hour of sweating and cursing before the lock snapped. The door creaked open, releasing a gust of air that smelled of ancient dust and something metallic like old blood. I stepped inside. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness. The room was tiny, 4 feet by 4 feet. The walls were padded with rotting burlap. There was a single wooden stool and a pile of disintegrated blankets. But it was the walls that caught my attention. They were covered in scratches, thousands of them, and in one corner the plaster had been worn smooth by years of repeated contact. I checked my watch, 2:16 a.m. I sat on the floor of that tiny, dark box. I turned off my flashlight. I waited. As the second hand ticked to the 17th minute, the sound began, but it wasn't coming from inside the room. Knock, knock, knock. It was coming from the outside. Someone was knocking on the door I had just opened. I lunged for the door, throwing it open. The hallway was empty. The house was silent. But when I looked at the outer side of the oak door, there were 3 fresh white scuffs on the wood. knuckle marks. I fled to the attic, the only place that felt remotely safe. I began tearing through the boxes left by previous tenants. Beneath a pile of moth-eaten coats, I found a leather-bound scrapbook. Inside were clippings, obituaries, local news. July 1994, boy missing from end of road. August 1994, search for mute child called off. I turned the page and found a photograph. It was a school portrait, a young boy with pale skin and wide, haunted eyes. He had a small crescent-shaped scar above his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a fall when he was 3. I walked to the dusty mirror propped against the attic wall. I brushed back my hair. There, reflected in the moonlight, was the same crescent scar. The realization didn't hit me like a blow, it washed over me like a cold tide. I looked at my hands. My knuckles were split and bleeding, the skin raw as if I had been striking stone for hours. I remembered now. Not the school, not the job. I remembered the dark. I remembered the smell of burlap. I remembered the sound of my father's boots walking away from the door. I hadn't moved back here. I had been drawn back like a moth to a dying flame. This house was my cage, and my mind had spent 20 years building a fantasy of a life just to survive the trauma. There was no lease. There was no landlord. There was only the loop. It is 2:17 a.m. once again. I am no longer in the attic. I am back in the room behind the wall. I don't remember walking here. The door is locked from the outside. The padlock is back in place, shiny and new. I can hear someone moving in the kitchen. I hear the clinking of a coffee mug. I hear the heavy thud of a suitcase being dropped on the floor. A new tenant, a new soul to share this silence with. I reach out. My arm feels heavy as if moving through water. I find the spot on the wall, the spot I have worn smooth over 30 years of existence. I ball my hand into a fist. I am not trying to scare him. I am not a monster. I am a reminder. I am the physical manifestation of a mistake that refused to be buried. I want him to know that he isn't alone in this house. We are all here. Elias, the couple, the boy. We are all part of the architecture now. I draw a breath of dusty air and strike the wood. Knock. Wait for the echo. Knock. Wait for his breath to hitch. Knock. Wait for the realization to set in. I can hear him freezing in his bed upstairs. I can hear his heart rate accelerating, a frantic drumming that matches my own. Sleep well, neighbor. The night is long, and at 2:17 a.m. we are finally together. Can you hear me? I'll ask again tomorrow, and the day after, until you finally remember who you are too. Welcome home.